I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. At a House Appropriations Committee hearing last week, Congressman Tom Cole spoke about the school shutdowns at the beginning of the pandemic. The Oklahoma Republican didn't want to point any fingers, but did say that shutting down schools was, quote, probably a big mistake. Cole asked Randi Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, if she had learned any lessons from the pandemic. Listen to her response here.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And again, thank all of our witnesses. This is a really good discussion. Let me go to COVID first. And I want to do this without pointing fingers at anybody, because I think we were dealing with an unprecedented situation and people basically did the best they could wherever they were at. And we've learned some things. My personal view, shutting down schools was probably a big mistake. And we have, in my state, two different examples, because the two largest school systems in Tulsa and Oklahoma City did shut down, but most of the rest did not. They shut down early in right at the end of the school year in 2020, but most of them reopened in the fall of 2020 and remained open under difficult circumstances. And they seem to have better results, honestly, in terms of their kids and all the social problems that we've explored at length in this community. So I'm just going to ask each of you, if you had one or two lessons learned out of COVID, I'd be very interested in what we should think about going forward, should we ever confront something like this again. And hopefully we don't. This was a once in a century event. So we may even in some ways be overthinking it right now. But we know we're going to be dealing with it on this committee for a long time. And we know in your school systems, you're going to be dealing with it because the after effects, this thing has a very long tail to it. So let me start, Ms. Weingartner, with you, and then anybody else on the panel. You got a couple of suggestions of things we ought to think about, lessons learned from COVID. I'd love to hear them.
So number one, and thank you for the question, Congressman Cole. Number one, we need real consistency to the extent possible in what the public health positioning is. People were very confused, particularly at, yes, COVID changed and the rules changed, but to the extent that we could have real consistency coming from all quarters that would have helped create trust would have been very, very helpful, because because we believe that safety and resources were the way to reopen schools. And there were many of the people on this committee that I had many conversations with about how we create both safety and in-person learning. That's number one. Number two, we learned how to trust teachers a lot at the beginning of this pandemic. There was no real platforms in lots of different places. There had been lots of virtual learning beforehand. The former Secretary of Education pushed it really hard, but we learned how to trust teachers a lot. Let's not stop trusting teachers now that we're back in person. They were ingenious, they were creative, so were bus drivers, so were food service workers. Let's actually trust them the same way we did when we were in an unprecedented pandemic.
Thank you, Ms. Carver. Thomas?
Thank you.
Doctor, I should say. I'm sorry.
It is Miss. Thank you. So I think something that we learned from the pandemic was that there's a sort of a distinction between short-term and long-term solutions to shortages and all of the staffing issues that we've been dealing with during the pandemic. And, the teacher shortage far predates the pandemic and was really exacerbated by the pandemic. And so I think it's important moving forward to think about what are those long-term solutions that can be enacted now so that we're not looking for short-term solutions when we're in crisis mode that really undercut the ultimate outcomes that we want to see for our students.
Thank you very much. Dr. Burke?
Thank you, Representative Cole. The number one lesson that we should take away from COVID is that we should fund students and not systems. That was a big part of the reason parents did not have educational continuity for their children, is that dollars go to school districts and not students themselves. And so when schools shut down, they had very few, if any, choices to make sure their children did have access to in-person instruction. And so that's a really important lesson moving forward, is that every single dollar that we spend should go directly to families to allow them to select into learning environments that work for them, reflect their values, and are open for instruction and safe and effective long-term.
I'm out of time, but Dr. West, if you could quickly respond. I think the chair is always generous with
Please,
a gavel.
time, Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. I appreciate that question. I think just to echo what Desiree said, our shortage in special education has been with us for, as long as I've been doing this work, at least 40 years. And like with many situations, COVID exacerbated what was already there. So we were able to really see this, and these long-term solutions are really important. I'd also point out that there are many students with disabilities with significant health conditions for whom a return to school posed a accelerated threat. So I think that's important to think about when we think about these public health kinds of situations. Clearly, it's preferable to be at school in person. Delivering something like speech therapy online, or if you need a one-to-one assistant, very challenging to do virtually. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Madam Chair, for your indulgence on the time. Yield back.
Absolutely. Thank you. And